Hi, I'm François. I'd like to thank the organizers of ViteConf for inviting me to speak to this amazing conference. I'm the author of Preview.js, a tool that lets you preview any UI component in your codebase instantly. Preview.js is based on top of Vite, and more specifically, Vite's JavaScript API. That's what I'm going to be talking about today. You know about Markdown, right? Did you know that in VS Code you can actually open a preview of a Markdown document directly in your IDE? Here, for example, I'm going to press Command K, then V, and I can see that panel open, and it will be updated pretty much as I type. Now, back in 2021, I was looking for an equivalent, but for React components. I wanted to be able to just select any React component in my code base and see a preview of it, with ideally also the ability to tweak the properties and see it updated as I update the code. But at least back then, there was no good solution for it. So I decided to build it. Initially, I called it React Preview. Then I realized it could actually be extended to other frameworks, and so I renamed it to Preview.js. Nowadays, Preview.js supports React, Preact, Solid, Svelte, Vue 2, and Vue 3. Here's an example of how Preview.js works. You select a component, it opens in that panel side by side, then you can tweak the properties, and you can also see that if I make changes to the code, it's reflected in the actual preview. Preview.js is only possible because of Vite's JavaScript API. So let's look into that. The Vite JavaScript API is actually very well documented on the website, so you can go and check it out right after this talk. In fact, the Vite CLI that you're probably most familiar with, under the hood, invokes that same Vite JavaScript API. For example, we can look in a cli.ts file in the Vite repo. The Vite dev command simply invokes create server, which is the same function that we just saw in the docs. So really, at the end of the day, the Vite CLI is mostly a proxy to the Vite JavaScript API. Now, before we get on to how Preview.js uses the Vite dev server, I need to give you a bit of an overview of how Preview.js itself works. There are actually three variants of Preview.js. There's the VS Code extension, the command line interface, and the IntelliJ plugin. They all invoke the same Node.js process that runs the Preview.js core package. The core package is in charge of two things. First is detecting components in the codebase, and the second is actually previewing them with some kind of server. Let's first talk about the first part, detecting components. For each different framework, such as React, Vue, etc., we have a different implementation of a framework plugin that provides especially a component and story analyzer. For example, for React, the React analyzer will look for JSX or TSX files, and inside of them, look for functions that return JSX. So for example, here we have a definition of a component called greeting, that is a function that returns some JSX. It will use the TypeScript compiler API to analyze this and figure out, okay, this is a function and its return type is some kind of JSX. And that means it's probably a component. On the other hand, foo is just a value 1, 2, 3, which is obviously not a component. And so we do that across the entire code base in order to know where are the components and where you can actually preview. The other thing that is important is detecting the type of the properties. In order to preview a component successfully, we need to also provide it valid properties that will not make it crash. So we again use the TypeScript compiler API to extract the type of the props parameter here. And we can see that here it actually gives us the result that props is an object with one field called name of type string. That is what allows us to generate a fake set of properties to render this component successfully. The second part of Preview.js is actually previewing the components. This is where Vite's JavaScript API comes into the picture. Preview.js will start the Preview.js server, which is just a thin wrapper around the Vite dev server. The Preview.js server will provide a Vite configuration made of a series of different plugins. Some of these plugins are framework specific. For example, we need to know how to convert JSX to valid JavaScript. And that's done slightly differently based on the framework. Some frameworks don't even support JSX, in which case we don't have a JSX plugin provided. Some other plugins are shared across all of Preview.js. For example, we have a virtual file plugin. This is what allows us to have preview as you type. For example, in VS Code, whenever you type something, we will send an update to the virtual file plugin, telling it to update its in-memory version of the file. It will then notify the Vite dev server, which then notifies the browser, telling it, hey, this module has been invalidated. When that module is reloaded by the browser, Vite dev server will actually load that file not from the file system, but from the virtual file plugin. That means that it can access this in-memory version that has been already updated, and there's not even any disk access in this process. This is what allows us to have really fast instant feedback as part of Preview.js. In this example, which I promise I did not speed up, you can see that on every keystroke, the preview is updated pretty much instantly within just a couple of milliseconds. This is just one example of how powerful a Vite plugin can be. You can do a lot of stuff with Vite plugins. You can transform code from one format to another. You can implement support from new file types. You can even simulate virtual files that don't exist on disk at all. One of the really cool things about Vite plugins is that they're actually compatible with a rollup format, which means that the Vite plugin that you just created also works for a bunch of different use cases where rollup is being used. If you're curious about the examples I've just shown, you can actually go and check out the repos fwouts/preview.js. More specifically, you can look for virtualplugin.ts as well as vitemanager.ts, where the create server invocation is. I hope I've inspired you to play around with Vite's JavaScript API. Even if you don't try that, consider if maybe writing a Vite plugin might help solve a problem for you or for your community. On that note, I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks.